I didn't panic at first, and that's the part that still surprises me. Ha ha ha. I reached into my bag the same careless way I always did, expecting the smooth edge of my phone, the familiar weight of my wallet, the cold touch of my glasses case, and instead my fingers closed around nothing but a crumpled receipt and a peppermint candy melted into its wrapper. And for a second I actually smiled, sighed, thinking, oh Margaret, you're getting forgetful. Because when you're old, you learn to blame yourself before you blame anyone else. But then I checked again, slower this time, deeper, even turning the bag upside down like that would magically change reality. And that's when the smile faded and something colder slid into its place, because my phone wasn't on the table, my wallet wasn't in the drawer, and my glasses were gone, and without them the room blurred into soft shapes. Like the world had decided to step back from me all at once. I stood there by the kitchen counter, blinking hard, steadying myself with one hand, telling my heart to slow down because panic never fixes anything. And at 78, you learn discipline the hard way. You learn how to breathe through fear, how to tuck it away until you can afford to feel it. But even with all that experience, there was a moment, just a small one, where I felt like someone had quietly pushed me out of my own life and shut the door behind me. And what scared me most wasn't the missing things, it was how cleanly they were gone, no mess, no sign of struggle, just absence. And absence has a way of speaking louder than noise. I tried to replay the last hour in my head, the way you rewind a memory hoping it will confess something you missed, and I saw my son's face again, the gentle smile he practiced so well. The way he hugged me a little too long when he left, his hand resting on my arm like I might shatter if he let go too quickly. You should let me help more, he'd said softly. You don't need to worry about everything anymore. And at the time I'd laughed, waved him off, because that's what mothers do. We pretend we're stronger than we are and weaker than we are at the same time, depending on what makes our children comfortable, sigh. But now, standing there without my glasses, the memory felt different, heavier, like a word you don't understand until years later when it suddenly fits too well. The house felt wrong, and that's the only way I can describe it, not broken into. Not messy, just wrong, like someone had walked through my life and moved everything an inch to the left. The lamp pointed the wrong way, the chair wasn't pushed in the way I always did it. Even the curtains were half drawn, though I was sure I'd opened them earlier, and I remember thinking, very calmly, very clearly, he's been here longer than he said, and that thought didn't come with panic, it came with certainty. The kind that settles deep in your bones, and I lowered myself into the chair because my knees were shaking now, not from fear exactly, but from understanding. I checked the small blue notebook I always kept nearby. The one where I wrote down things I didn't trust my memory to hold forever. Account numbers, reminders, names, important little truths, and of course that was gone too. Ha ha ha, of course it was, and that's when a strange thing happened. Instead of crying, instead of shouting, I felt something inside me go very still, like a lake freezing over, because this wasn't forgetfulness, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't even care gone too far. This was removal, quiet, polite, deliberate, and the worst part was realizing how easy it had been for him, how naturally he'd slipped into my space, into my routines, into my trust. I closed my eyes and breathed long and slow, the way you do when you're trying not to let fear take the wheel, and I told myself what I'd told myself my whole life: you are not helpless just because you are old. But the truth pressed against me anyway. Cold and undeniable. Without my phone I couldn't call anyone. Without my wallet I had no ID, no cards, no proof of who I was outside these walls, and without my glasses, well, without my glasses the world became something I had to feel instead of see. And that's when the sound of a car door slamming outside cut through the quiet like a crack of thunder. I turned my head toward the window. But all I saw was a smear of gray and green, shapes without edges. And then I heard his voice, familiar, calm, far too calm. Mom, we need to talk, and my stomach tightened because he'd just left not even an hour ago. There was no reason to come back unless something had gone wrong, or unless this was always the plan, and before I could answer, the door opened. Not knocked, not hesitated, opened, because he still had the spare key, and when you realize that, when you realize how many small permissions you've handed over without thinking, it feels like discovering your house has more doors than you ever knew about. He stepped inside, his outline a blur to me now, but his voice was clear, steady, practiced. You seemed confused earlier, he said. I think it might be better if you come stay with us for a bit. And I almost laughed, a short, breathy sound that caught in my throat because there it was, the sentence people use when they've already decided for you. The sentence that sounds like concern but lands like a verdict, and I didn't move, I didn't argue, I just listened. And in that listening something clicked into place, all the moved objects, the missing notebook, the vanished phone. The way my world had quietly shrunk while I wasn't looking. He reached for my arm again, gently, always gently, and said, "You'll feel better once we get you settled," and that word, settled, wrapped itself around my chest like a rope. Because settled is what you do with dust, with estates, with things that no longer move on their own, and for the first time since he was a child, I looked at my son, really looked and saw not love, not worry, but confidence. The confidence of someone who believes you have no way to resist, no one to call, nowhere to turn, and standing there, half blind in my own kitchen, I understood something that made my breath hitch. He thought I was already trapped. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that the moment my phone, my wallet, and my glasses disappeared, something else woke up inside me, something older than fear, older than obedience. A quiet awareness that whispered, "Pay attention now," because this wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a test, and as he guided me toward the door with that careful, controlling kindness, I realized that if he thought cutting me off would make me powerless, then he didn't know me nearly as well as he thought, and that mistake was going to matter. I used to tell myself that I was imagining things, sigh, that the strange feelings crept in only because age makes you suspicious of your own thoughts, and maybe that's the most dangerous lie we ever tell ourselves. Because it sounds responsible, it sounds mature, it sounds like wisdom, but really it's just fear wearing a sensible coat, and if I'm honest, the signs had been there long before that night. Quietly tapping on the glass while I pretended not to hear them, ha, little things at first, harmless things, things you brush off because the alternative feels too painful to consider. Like how my son started visiting more often without calling ahead, always cheerful, always saying he was just in the area, always insisting on making tea even though he knew exactly how I liked it and still got it wrong. Too much sugar, the mug placed slightly off, like he wasn't fully present, like he was busy noticing other things instead, and I remember thinking once, very casually, he's grown distant. Not he's paying attention. There were days when I'd reach for my mail and find it already sorted, envelopes opened, stacked neatly as if someone had done me a favor, and when I asked about it, he laughed and said, "I didn't want you worrying over boring paperwork," and I laughed too, because that's what we do when someone helps us just a little too much. We laugh so we don't have to ask why they felt entitled to do it in the first place. And then there were the small rearrangements, the kind that make you question your own memory, a folder moved to a different shelf, a drawer not quite shut the way you always shut it. The chair in my study nudged just slightly out of place, and every time I noticed, I told myself, you probably did that. Because it's easier to doubt yourself than to doubt someone you love, I started losing track of things that had never gone missing before, important things, papers I'd kept in the same place for years, and instead of asking questions, I apologized to him, to myself, to the empty room, as if misplacing my own life was an inconvenience to others, and he would smile, that calm, patient smile, and say, "It's okay, Mom, that's why I'm here." And at the time it sounded comforting, reassuring even, but now, looking back, I can hear the shift in that sentence. The way "I'm here" slowly began to mean I'm in charge, and I wish I'd understood that sooner. I really do. The worst part wasn't the things he did, it was the way he made me doubt what I felt, because every time I hesitated, every time my chest tightened with something that felt like warning, he softened his voice, slowed his movements, leaned closer like I was a fragile thing, and said things like, "You've been under a lot of stress," or "You're thinking too much," or my favorite, "You don't need to worry about that anymore." And you hear those words often enough, you start to believe them, you start handing over pieces of yourself without realizing they don't come back once they're gone, sigh, and I hate admitting this, but there were moments when I felt relieved. Relieved not to decide, relieved not to think, relieved to let someone else steer, because independence is heavy, especially when your body reminds you daily that it isn't young anymore. But relief is a tricky thing. It feels like rest until you realize it's actually restraint, and the day I should have listened to myself was the day I caught him standing in my study, too still, staring at the drawer where I kept my important documents. And when I asked what he was doing, he laughed too quickly and said he was just admiring old photos, even though the photos weren't there. And my heart skipped in that strange, uneven way it does when your mind and your instincts stop agreeing. Ha, I remember joking, "You always were curious," but inside something whispered. That wasn't curiosity. I told myself it was harmless because that's what mothers do. We rewrite danger as misunderstanding. We soften sharp edges so we don't have to face the possibility that someone we raised could hurt us. And that's the truth no one likes to talk about. Sometimes love makes you blind long before age ever does. And so I ignored the way he started asking more questions about my finances, casual questions wrapped in concern. "Are you comfortable managing everything? Wouldn't it be easier if someone helped? What happens if something happens to you?" And every question felt reasonable on its own, but together they formed a net, slowly, quietly. And I walked right into it because I believed the person holding it cared about my safety. There were nights I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying small moments, my chest tightening for no clear reason. And I'd sigh and tell myself to sleep, to stop worrying, because worry feels selfish when you're old, like you're taking up space you shouldn't, and I realize now how cruel that belief is. How it teaches us to shrink just when we should be standing taller, And if I'm being honest, part of me didn't want to see the truth because seeing it would mean accepting that I was vulnerable, not weak, but vulnerable. And vulnerability is something the world loves to take advantage of. By the time the night came when my phone and wallet and glasses disappeared, the groundwork had already been laid, the permissions granted, the boundaries softened. The trust stretched thin, and that's the part people don't understand when they hear stories like mine. They imagine one sudden act, one dramatic betrayal, but it doesn't happen that way. It happens in inches, in smiles, in favors you didn't ask for, in silence you thought was peace. And standing there later, half blind and missing pieces of myself, I realized that the danger hadn't started that night, it had started months earlier. In moments I chose to ignore because ignoring felt kinder than confronting. And that realization hurt more than fear ever could, because it meant I wasn't just trapped by what he'd done, I was trapped by what I'd allowed. And as that thought settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable, I understood something that made my breath catch. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be talked through. This was a pattern, carefully built, patiently rehearsed. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And that's when I knew, with a certainty that made my hands tremble, that whatever he was planning next, it wasn't going to stop on its own. There's a moment when help stops feeling like help and starts feeling like something else, something tighter, quieter, and it doesn't arrive with shouting or force, it arrives wrapped in soft words and patient smiles. Sigh, and that's exactly how it happened with my son, because after the small signs, the moved papers, the opened mail, the gentle questions, he shifted into a new role without ever asking permission. And the strangest part was how natural it felt at first. He started offering to take things off my plate, paying a bill for me, calling a service company on my behalf, standing a little too close when I reviewed paperwork as if my eyes needed guidance even when they didn't, and every time I hesitated, he reminded me how tired I must be, how stressful life can get at my age, how much easier it would be if someone else handled the harder parts. And I remember nodding along, not because I agreed, but because disagreeing felt exhausting, like arguing against gravity itself. He spoke in that calm, even tone that leaves no room for resistance. "You've done enough," he'd say, "or let me worry about this now." And when I protested lightly at first, he laughed it off. "You raised me to be responsible, remember?" And hearing my own words reflected back at me, disarmed me more effectively than anger ever could. Because what mother wants to admit that the child she taught to stand on his own feet was now slowly stepping on hers, and so I let him. Little by little, because it felt temporary, because it felt reversible, because I told myself I could take things back any time I wanted. The language changed before the actions did, and that's something I wish I'd understood sooner. Because once someone starts speaking for you, deciding what you need, what you can handle, what you should be protected from, the ground beneath you begins to shift, and suddenly you're standing on something that moves without asking. And he'd say things like, "You don't need to worry about that," or "I've already taken care of it," and I'd feel a strange mix of relief and discomfort. Relief because responsibility is heavy. Discomfort because the relief wasn't mine to choose, and I'd sigh quietly, telling myself I was being ungrateful. Telling myself help always feels strange at first, but then came the sentences that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. Sentences like, "You shouldn't be dealing with this alone anymore," or "It's not safe for you to manage everything yourself." And those words stuck with me, not because they were cruel, but because they were definitive, as if a decision had already been made and I was just being informed. And when I pushed back even a little, when I said I was fine, that I'd been managing for decades, his face would soften into that practiced concern. "I know you think you are," he'd reply. "But sometimes we don't see our own limits." And that sentence lingered in the air long after he left, heavy and unsettling. Because it planted a question I hadn't asked myself before. I started noticing how often he spoke about me as if I weren't fully present, even when I was sitting right there, discussing things for me instead of with me. Explaining my habits, my forgetfulness, my supposed confusion, and people listened, because confidence is persuasive, and age makes others quick to believe you're fading even when you aren't. And I felt myself shrinking in those moments. Not physically, but socially, like my role was being rewritten in real time, from person to problem, from decision maker to responsibility, and the more that happened, the harder it felt to interrupt, to reclaim the conversation. Because no one likes to appear difficult, especially not an old woman who has been taught her whole life to be agreeable. The cruel irony is that there were moments when I wanted to accept it, when the idea of not worrying, not deciding, not carrying the weight of independence felt tempting, like a warm chair you sink into without checking if you'll be able to stand again. Sigh. But every time I leaned into that feeling, something inside me protested quietly. A small, stubborn voice saying, "This isn't rest, this is surrender," and I ignored it because it was easier to let the louder voice win, the voice that sounded like love, like duty, like family, and that's how control works when it's done well. It convinces you that resisting is selfish. I remember one afternoon very clearly, sitting at the kitchen table while he reviewed a stack of papers I hadn't asked him to touch, my name printed neatly across the top of each page. And he spoke about them as if they were already his to manage, explaining timelines, options, outcomes, and when I reached out to take them back just to look, he held onto them a second longer than necessary and said gently, "Don't strain your eyes," and that one sentence sent a ripple of unease through me, because it wasn't concern, it was instruction, and I laughed awkwardly, pulling my hand back, pretending it didn't matter, but it mattered. It mattered a lot. From that day on, the house felt different when he was in it, smaller somehow, like the walls leaned in when he spoke, and I found myself second-guessing my own instincts more often. Asking permission for things I'd never needed permission for before, explaining myself, justifying decisions that used to be simple, and every explanation made it harder to stop explaining. Because once you start defending your independence, you've already let someone question it, ha ha ha, and I wish I could say I noticed immediately that I stood up and stopped it, but the truth is uglier, the truth is I adapted. Because adapting feels safer than confronting, and I told myself I was being practical, that this was just how life changed as you got older. What I didn't realize then, what I only understood later, was that control doesn't need force when it has patience, it just needs time and trust. And by the time the night came when my world was stripped down to nothing but blurred shapes and missing objects, the foundation had already been laid. Carefully, deliberately, with my reluctant cooperation, and as that truth settled into me, heavy and undeniable, I felt a sharp ache of regret, not because I was powerless, but because I had mistaken kindness for consent. And that mistake had almost cost me everything, and as my son guided me with that calm certainty, convinced I was ready to be handled, a single thought cut through my fear like a blade. If he believed I had already surrendered, then he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The night he came back too soon still echoes in my chest, sigh, because nothing good ever returns in a hurry, and when I heard the sound of tires on gravel again, so close to when he'd just left, my first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion, a quiet, puzzled feeling that slid quickly into something heavier, something colder, because people don't come back unless they've forgotten something, or unless they're checking that what they set in motion is unfolding the way they planned. Ha, I stood there in my own living room, half blind without my glasses, listening to the engine idle outside, counting the seconds, and with every second my certainty grew that this visit wasn't about concern. It was about confirmation. The door opened without knocking, the same spare key turning in the lock like it had every right to be there, and that small sound, that familiar click, made my stomach tighten more than shouting ever could. Because it reminded me how many doors I'd unlocked for him long before this one, and he stepped inside with that same careful posture, that same softened voice. "I was worried about you," he said, as if worry explained urgency. As if worry justified intrusion, and I remember thinking how strange it was that his worry always seemed to require my silence, my compliance, my stillness. He stood there for a moment, looking around, his eyes moving quickly, checking the room the way people do when they're making sure nothing has changed, and I could feel it then, that subtle shift in the air, like the house itself knew it was being evaluated, and he spoke again, slower now, firmer. "You seemed confused earlier," he said, and there it was again, that word, confused, slipping into the conversation like a quiet accusation, and I wanted to laugh, I really did. Because confusion is such a convenient explanation when you want to erase someone's version of events. Oh, but I didn't laugh, I stayed still, because something inside me was paying attention now in a way it hadn't before. He moved closer. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, that familiar scent that used to mean hugs and holidays and safety, and now only made my chest tight, and he reached out, not grabbing, never grabbing, just touching my elbow lightly, guiding rather than pulling, and said, "I think it might be better if you came with me for a few days," and I noticed how he didn't ask, how there was no question mark in his voice, only a period, firm and final. As if the decision had already been signed somewhere I hadn't been invited to read, and that's when I understood that this wasn't a conversation, it was a transition. I asked him where we were going. My voice steady despite the noise inside my head, and he smiled that practiced smile, the one that smooths over discomfort. "Somewhere quiet," he said, "where you can rest." And rest sounded like relief until I realized he was describing a place chosen for me, not by me, and my hands curled slightly at my sides, because when someone else decides where you should rest, they've already decided how much space you deserve, and I could feel my heart pounding now, not wildly, but insistently, like a warning bell I could no longer ignore. He kept talking, filling the room with words meant to soften the edges. "You've been under so much stress, you don't need to manage everything anymore. Let me handle this," and each sentence landed heavier than the last, stacking up until I could barely breathe beneath them. Sigh, and I realized then how carefully this moment had been built, how the earlier questions, the offers of help, the quiet rearranging of my life had all been leading here, to a point where resistance would make me look unreasonable. Ungrateful, unstable even, and standing there, missing pieces of myself, I saw the trap clearly for the first time. He guided me toward the door, still gentle, still patient, and I followed not because I agreed, but because my body knew something my mind was still catching up to, that sudden movements would only give him the excuse he needed. And as we stepped outside, the cool night air brushed my face, carrying the sounds of a world that felt suddenly far away, and I remember noticing how quiet the street was, how no neighbors were out, how the timing felt deliberate, like he'd chosen a moment when no one would see me leave. Ha ha ha, and that thought sent a shiver through me deeper than the cold ever could. The car door opened, and he waited, watching me carefully, gauging my movements, my balance, my hesitation, and when I paused just for a second, he placed his hand on my back, not pushing, not forcing, just enough pressure to tip the choice away from me, and I sat, the door closing with a sound that felt far too final for such a small action. And as the seatbelt clicked into place, not by my hand but by his, something inside me snapped quietly, because that single act said more than any argument ever could. It said, "You are cargo now," as the car pulled away. My house shrinking behind us into a blur of light and shadow, I felt a wave of emotion rise up, grief, disbelief, anger, all tangled together, and for a moment my eyes burned, tears threatening to spill. Awe, because there is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes from realizing the person you trusted most believes you are no longer capable of choosing for yourself. And that heartbreak doesn't shout, it settles, heavy and suffocating. And I pressed my hands together in my lap, forcing myself to breathe, to stay present, to stay aware. He talked as he drove, explaining, reassuring, outlining plans I hadn't agreed to, and I listened not because I was convinced, but because listening gave me information, and information felt like the only thing I could still claim as mine. And somewhere between the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the road, a single clear thought rose above the noise. Sharp and undeniable, he believed this was already over. He believed I had crossed the line from person to problem, and as that realization settled in, hard and heavy, I understood that whatever came next wouldn't be about discussion or understanding, it would be about control, and if I didn't find a way to reclaim myself soon, I would disappear into the role he'd written for me, and that knowledge, more than fear, more than anger, became the quiet fire that kept me awake, because I knew then that the next choice I made would decide whether I remained myself or became someone else's responsibility forever. What frightened me most wasn't that he took me somewhere I didn't choose, it was how calmly he did it, sigh, how smoothly the whole thing unfolded, as if we were following a routine we'd practiced many times before, and in a way we had. Just not all at once, because control doesn't always arrive dragging you by the arm, sometimes it simply opens the door and waits for you to step through on your own. And that's exactly how it felt as the car moved farther away from my home, the engine humming steadily, the road stretching on, and my son speaking in that even, reassuring voice as if nothing extraordinary was happening at all. "Ha ha ha, you're safe," he kept saying, and I remember thinking how strange that word sounded coming from someone who had just taken away every way I had to prove I existed outside of him. I sat there quietly, hands folded in my lap, not because I was calm, but because I understood something important in that moment. That panic would only confirm the story he was already telling himself about me, that I was confused, unstable, incapable. And I refused to give him that, so I stayed still, listening, watching the blur of the world slide past the window, letting my fear sink down into something sharper, something more useful, and the longer we drove, the more certain I became that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be talked through. This was a decision he had made long before tonight, and I was only now being informed. He talked about rest, about doctors, about getting everything sorted, using words that sounded reasonable until you noticed how often they erased my voice, and I answered when necessary, short, careful replies, because I didn't want to provoke him, not yet. I wanted to understand how far he intended to take this, and that's when I realized something chilling. He wasn't nervous at all, not even a little. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in his tone. Only confidence, the confidence of someone who believes there will be no consequences, and that told me more than any confession ever could. When the car finally slowed and turned onto a rougher road, my heart gave a small, painful thud. Because even without my glasses, even without clear sight, I knew this place. I knew the smell of pine and damp earth, the way the air grew quieter, heavier, and I understood then that he had chosen a place far from anyone else. A place where my absence wouldn't be noticed right away, and that knowledge settled into me like a stone, heavy and cold, because isolation isn't just about being alone. It's about being forgotten long enough for someone else to decide your future for you. He parked and stepped out first, opening my door with that same careful politeness, offering his hand, and I took it not because I trusted him, But because refusing would only make things worse, and as my feet touched the uneven ground, my knees trembled slightly, partly from age, partly from the weight of what was happening, and he noticed, of course he did. "See," he said gently. "This is exactly why you need help." And those words stung more than anger ever could because he was using my body against me. My natural limitations turned into evidence for his control, and I swallowed hard. Forcing myself to stand straighter, to walk without stumbling, to deny him even that small victory. Inside, the place felt wrong immediately, not unfamiliar, but altered. Like someone had rearranged it with a purpose that wasn't comfort, and even through my blurred vision I could sense it. The furniture moved closer together, the rugs gone, the sharp corners softened. All the little changes people make when they don't want you moving freely, and I felt a tightness in my chest, a quiet weeping pressure that threatened to break through. Ha, because it dawned on me then that this wasn't about keeping me safe, it was about keeping me contained. He set down a bag beside me, my bag packed without my permission, clothes chosen for me, items decided for me. And he spoke as if this was kindness, as if preparing my life for me excused taking it over. And when I asked about my phone, my wallet, my glasses, he brushed it aside with practiced ease. "We'll sort all that out later," and that word. Later echoed loudly in my mind because later is where control likes to hide, always just out of reach, always promised, never delivered. When he finally left me alone, even for a short while, the silence rushed in. Thick and suffocating, and I stood there, half-blind, missing pieces of myself in a place chosen without my consent, and something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because I understood then that this wasn't temporary, not unless I made it temporary, and as I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed, my hands shaking despite my efforts to stay composed, a quiet thought surfaced through the fear. Through the anger, through the grief, if I didn't find a way to act soon, if I let myself accept this even for a moment, then this place, this role, this version of my life would become permanent, and that realization, more than anything else, told me that being taken without force was still being taken, and that the hardest part wasn't being trapped, it was knowing that escape would require more courage than I thought I still had. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting ever could be. Sigh, because once he left me alone in that place, once the door closed and his footsteps faded, the quiet pressed in from all sides, thick and watchful. And I remember standing there for a long moment without moving, my hands hanging uselessly at my sides, my eyes struggling to make sense of shapes that refused to sharpen because without my glasses. The room looked like a memory rather than a place, and that alone was terrifying, not the darkness, but the way it made me feel smaller, disconnected. As if the world had pulled away just enough to remind me how easily I could be erased. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed slowly, carefully, every movement measured, because fear has a way of making your body clumsy. And I couldn't afford that now, not when I needed my mind more than ever. And as I sat there, listening to the faint sounds of the woods outside, the creak of old wood settling, the distant whisper of wind through trees, something unexpected happened. The panic didn't grow, it shrank, just a little, enough to leave room for thought. And in that small opening, clarity slipped in, quiet and sharp. I realized then that he believed the hardest part was over. That once I was alone, isolated, cut off, I would soften, comply, accept whatever explanation he offered next, and maybe that works for some people, maybe fear breaks them open, but for me, fear had always done something different. It made me pay attention, it made me notice details, patterns, possibilities, and sitting there in that stillness, I started to think not about what I'd lost, but about what I still had. I had my memory. I had my habits. I had decades of living inside my own skin, learning how systems worked, learning where people usually made mistakes, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my son's confidence came from assumption, not certainty. He assumed that taking my phone meant taking my voice, that taking my wallet meant taking my identity, that taking my glasses meant taking my ability to act, and those assumptions rested on one dangerous belief: that everything important about my life existed outside of me. I stood and walked slowly around the room, letting my hands trail along the walls, the furniture, reacquainting myself with the space by touch rather than sight, and with every step. My breathing steadied, my thoughts sharpened, because familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence is the enemy of fear. And as my fingers brushed over familiar surfaces, I remembered something that made my heart skip, not wildly, but with purpose, something I hadn't thought about in a long time because I'd never needed it before. Years ago, after my husband passed, we'd updated the house quietly, carefully, not because we expected danger, but because he believed in preparation, believed that the worst moments don't announce themselves. And as that memory rose, warm and steady, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, relief that the past had left me something useful. Sadness that I needed it now, but sadness can wait, survival doesn't. I paused, leaning against the wall, and let myself feel it for just a second, the ache in my chest, the urge to cry. The quiet weeping that threatened to spill over because pretending you're not afraid doesn't make you brave, it just makes you dishonest, and I was afraid, deeply, painfully afraid, but fear didn't own me, not yet. And I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, took a slow breath, and reminded myself of something important. Fear is information, and information can be used. At that moment, I want to say something to you. Because if you're listening to this and you've ever felt cornered, ignored, or made to believe you were powerless just because someone else decided you were, then stay with me, subscribe not for drama, but for stories like this. Stories that remind us that strength doesn't always look loud or young or obvious. Sometimes it looks like sitting still in the dark and thinking clearly when someone expects you to give up. The more I thought, the more I understood that he hadn't planned for resistance, not real resistance, because people who rely on control rarely imagine the controlled thinking for themselves, and that was his mistake, not taking me there. Not isolating me, but underestimating the quiet persistence that comes with age, and that realization sparked something inside me, a small, steady determination that warmed my chest despite the cold room. I began to test the space gently, opening drawers, checking doors, listening for sounds that told me what was locked and what wasn't, not rushing. Because rushing would only betray me, and with each small discovery, my sense of agency returned piece by piece, like finding fragments of myself scattered across the floor and carefully fitting them back together. And even when I found barriers, things bolted or closed or moved out of reach, I didn't despair because barriers mean intention, and intention means someone cared enough to plan. And planning always leaves gaps. As night settled deeper around me, I sat again, my back against the wall, my knees drawn close, not in defeat but in preparation, and I allowed myself one honest sigh. The kind that empties your lungs and clears your head, because whatever came next would require patience, timing, and courage, and those things don't respond well to panic. And in that quiet, with the darkness pressing close, I understood something that changed everything. He believed this place had ended my choices, but in reality it had narrowed them, and narrowed choices are easier to see clearly. I didn't know yet how I would act or when, or what form it would take, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to wait for permission to reclaim my life, not from him, not from fear, not from the limits of my own body. And as that certainty settled in, firm and unshakable, I felt a strange calm wash over me, because once you accept that doing nothing is the most dangerous choice of all, action becomes inevitable, and somewhere in the quiet of that room, while he believed me broken and helpless, I began to plan, and that planning, more than anything else, meant the story was far from over. The truth is, he never asked the right questions, sigh, and that's how I knew he didn't really understand me at all, because if he'd paused even once to ask instead of assume, none of this would have worked the way he thought it would. He assumed that age meant fragility, that isolation meant obedience, that silence meant surrender, and that belief wrapped around everything he did like a blindfold, not for me, but for himself. And sitting there in the dim quiet of that place, I could almost see the shape of his mistake forming, clear as day, even without my glasses. He never asked how I'd managed my life for decades without anyone hovering over me, never asked how many crises I'd handled quietly, how many nights I'd stayed awake making decisions that shaped not just my life, but his, and that oversight mattered because people who underestimate you tend to plan shallowly. They focus on what they can take away instead of what they can't touch, and what he couldn't touch was the part of me that had learned long ago how to survive without applause, without help, without anyone noticing it. All I thought about the house then, my house, the one he believed he had stripped of all usefulness, and a faint, almost amused breath escaped me. Because he'd taken the obvious things, the phone, the wallet, the glasses, the things that scream power in a modern world, but he hadn't asked what existed beyond the obvious, what had been built quietly into the bones of that place years ago. Not out of fear, but out of care, care from a man who believed that safety didn't come from strength alone, but from preparation. My husband had been like that, always thinking 2 steps ahead, always asking what if when everyone else said don't worry, and I used to tease him for it, for being overly cautious, overly prepared, for turning simple things into systems. But now, in that stillness, his voice echoed in my memory with a clarity that made my chest tighten. Redundancy matters, he'd say, because the one thing you rely on is always the first thing to fail. And I remember rolling my eyes, laughing, telling him he worried too much, and now here I was, alive because he did. My son never asked about that, never asked what my husband had left behind besides memories, never asked what changes we'd made after he was gone. Because he assumed nothing important could exist without his knowledge, and that assumption was his blind spot, because the most powerful safeguards are the ones no one thinks to look for, the ones installed not for drama, but for peace of mind, and peace of mind doesn't announce itself. As I sat there, replaying conversations, replaying moments, I realized how often my son had spoken with certainty instead of curiosity, how rarely he'd asked, "What do you want?" or "What have you already prepared for?" And how often he'd replace those questions with statements, "You don't need, you can't manage, I'll take care of it," and those statements revealed everything. Because when someone stops asking questions, they've already decided the answers don't matter. That realization didn't make me angry, not anymore. It made me focused, because anger scatters your energy, but focus gathers it. And I needed everything gathered now, every memory, every habit, every lesson I'd absorbed over a lifetime of paying attention, and the more I focused, the clearer it became that his plan relied entirely on me staying still, staying quiet. Staying convinced that the tools he'd taken were the only ones I had, and that belief was fragile, dangerously fragile. I shifted slightly, testing the quiet around me, listening for any sound that might tell me I was being watched or monitored, and when nothing answered back, I allowed myself the smallest smile, just a flicker, because people who think they've already won stop paying attention. And he had stopped paying attention the moment he left me alone, convinced that isolation would do his work for him, convinced that the absence of resistance meant success. I began to think differently then. Not about escape in a dramatic sense, not about running or shouting or forcing anything, but about alignment, about putting myself back in the center of my own story, because power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from activating something quietly and letting the world respond on its own. And as that thought took shape, I felt my heartbeat steady, my breath deepen. The fear recede just enough to make room for resolve. He believed he had erased my connections, but he never asked what connections existed beyond what he could see, beyond what he could hold in his hands, and that was his greatest mistake. Because the strongest lines aren't always visible, they're built into routines, into walls, into systems designed to listen even when you can't shout, and remembering that filled me with a strange warmth. A grounded confidence that surprised me with its intensity. For the first time since he'd taken me from my home, I didn't feel trapped, not truly, because I understood something fundamental. This situation didn't require strength, speed, or confrontation. It required timing and intention, and those were things I still possessed in abundance. And as I sat there, gathering my thoughts, letting the plan form slowly and deliberately, one final truth settled into me. Heavy and reassuring at the same time. He thought he'd taken away my ability to act, but all he'd really done was force me to choose the right moment, and when that moment came, he wouldn't see it coming. Because he never asked the one question that mattered most: what if she's more prepared than I am? The moment itself didn't feel dramatic the way people imagine these things do. There was no sudden rush of courage, no thunder in the background, just a quiet heaviness in my chest and the steady awareness that if I waited any longer, I might lose the chance entirely, and that awareness sharpened everything. Ha. I stood there in the dimness, my hands slightly unsteady, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was about to do, because once done, it couldn't be undone. And that kind of decision always asks you to cross a line you can never step back over. I moved slowly, deliberately, feeling my way through the space the way I always did when the lights were low, trusting memory more than sight. Because memory had never failed me the way people sometimes do. And as my fingers brushed familiar surfaces, the calm I'd been holding onto tightened into focus like a knot pulled firm, and for a fleeting moment, I thought of all the times I'd stood in this same house believing I would never need what I was about to use, believing that preparation was something for other people, for those who lived louder, riskier lives. And yet here I was, grateful beyond words that someone had thought ahead when I hadn't. I paused, just long enough to steady my breathing, because my heart had started to pound in that way it does when fear and hope collide. And I reminded myself of something simple, something grounding. Panic wastes time, and time was the only thing I didn't have. And so I leaned in, close enough that my breath warmed the air, and I spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just clearly, just once, the phrase I'd practiced years ago and never thought I'd need. And as the words left my mouth, they felt strangely ordinary, almost anticlimactic, and yet I knew, deep in my bones, that everything had just shifted. There was no siren, no immediate response, no voice answering me back, and for half a second, doubt crept in, sharp and cruel, whispering that maybe I'd remembered wrong. Maybe time had erased what I thought was there, maybe I was finally too late, and my chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. But then I felt it, not heard it exactly, felt it, a faint vibration in the walls. A subtle hum beneath the silence, like something waking up after a long sleep, and my breath caught because that sensation carried recognition with it, the kind you don't mistake for imagination. I stayed still, barely daring to move, as if any sound might break whatever fragile connection I'd just made, and in that stillness the world seemed to hold its breath with me, the darkness no longer threatening, just waiting. And I realized then that the hardest part wasn't speaking the words, It was trusting that they would be enough, trusting something invisible to do its job when everything visible had already failed me, and that trust. That surrender to a system instead of a person felt oddly easier than trusting my own family ever had. Time stretched in a strange way after that, minutes feeling both endless and fleeting, and I sat down slowly. My legs finally acknowledging the strain they'd been under, my hands resting in my lap, fingers interlaced to keep them from shaking too much, because the fear hadn't vanished, not at all, it had simply changed shape. No longer the fear of being helpless, but the fear of being discovered too soon, of having my choice interrupted before it could reach beyond these walls. Awe, and I listened harder than I ever had in my life. Every sound took on meaning. The distant creak of wood, the soft sigh of the house settling, the faint whisper of air moving through vents, and each time I thought I heard something more, something closer, my pulse jumped, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to stay present. To trust that once set in motion, this process didn't require my supervision, because that was the whole point. It was designed to work even when I couldn't, and understanding that brought a small, unexpected sense of relief. I thought then about how confident my son had been when he left, how certain he was that removing my tools meant removing my options, and I almost laughed quietly to myself, not out of spite, but out of disbelief at how narrow his understanding had been, because control relies so heavily on visibility, on seeing what you can touch, what you can confiscate, what you can explain away. And the moment you step outside of that visible world, the moment you activate something that doesn't need permission or presence, control begins to crumble, not loudly but decisively. Still, I knew it wasn't over, not yet. Because activating help doesn't erase danger, it just shifts the balance, and as I sat there in the dim light, my ears straining for any sign of movement outside, a new tension settled into me, sharper than fear, more focused. The awareness that whatever happened next would unfold quickly, and I would have to meet it with the same calm that had carried me this far. Because hesitation now would undo everything I'd just set in motion. I pressed my palms together and closed my eyes for a brief moment, allowing myself a single silent plea, not for rescue, not for comfort, but for clarity. For the strength to hold my ground if I needed to speak if I was confronted, to stay steady if my resolve was tested. Because the act itself was done, irreversible. And the consequences were already traveling toward me through channels I couldn't see or hear, and all I could do now was wait. And as I waited, listening to the quiet, feeling the faint hum of something alive in the walls around me, I understood something that settled deep and solid inside my chest. Using that emergency line hadn't made me brave, it had simply reminded me that I was never as powerless as he believed, and that reminder, more than anything else, meant that whatever came through that door next, whether it arrived with answers or confrontation, the balance of this story had already changed, even if the world outside hadn't caught up to it yet. I knew he would realize it before anyone else arrived. People who think they're in control always feel the moment it slips through their fingers, even if they don't understand how, and I sensed it before I heard it. A tension in the air, a sharpness that hadn't been there moments earlier, and then the sound came, an engine outside, stopping too fast, tires crunching gravel with urgency instead of ease, and my heart thudded once, hard, not in panic, but in recognition, because that wasn't the sound of someone coming to check on me, that was the sound of someone rushing to fix a mistake. The door opened again without knocking, harder this time, less polite, and when he stepped inside, his calm was gone, replaced by something brittle, something tight around the edges, and even without my glasses I could see it in the way he moved, the way his shoulders were set, the way his breath came a little too fast. "What did you do?" he asked, and that question told me everything, because it wasn't curiosity, it was fear, the fear of someone who knows the story has started moving without him. Awe, and I stayed seated, hands folded, posture calm. Because nothing unsettles a controlling person more than realizing their power no longer provokes a reaction. He crossed the room quickly, scanning, listening, as if the walls themselves might betray him, and when he turned back to me, his voice dropped, urgent now. "You shouldn't have touched anything," he said, and I almost smiled because that sentence revealed the truth he'd been hiding from himself. He believed I was something to be managed, an environment to be controlled, not a person capable of acting, and I answered him quietly, "I didn't touch anything," and the silence that followed was loud because he knew I was lying, and worse, he knew why. The house responded before I needed to say more. Not with noise, not with drama, just a faint shift, a barely noticeable hum beneath the floor, the kind you only hear if you're listening for it, and he froze, his head turning slightly, eyes narrowing, trying to locate the source. And in that moment I saw it clearly, the crack in his confidence, the first real doubt, because control depends on predictability, and something had just happened that he hadn't predicted. "What is that?" he demanded. Stepping closer, and I met his gaze, steady despite the tremor in my hands. "It's the part you forgot," I said, and that was all it took, because realization dawned slowly across his face, disbelief giving way to calculation. Calculation giving way to panic, and he moved toward the phone, toward the walls, toward anything he thought he could undo, and I felt a sharp surge of fear then, not because I regretted my choice, but because I understood how dangerous people become when they realize they're losing control. Before he could reach anything, there was a sound outside, another car, then another, doors closing, voices carrying through the night, firm, unfamiliar. And he stopped mid-step, his breath hitching, because no amount of reassurance or explanation works once other voices enter the story. And I could hear it then, the shift, the power leaving him not with a fight but with a quiet inevitability. Awe, and he turned back to me, his expression pleading now. "You don't understand," he said. "This will ruin everything." And I answered, "No," my voice steady. "This will reveal everything." The knock came then, strong, official. And it echoed through the house like punctuation at the end of a long, painful sentence. And he stood there, caught between me and the door, between the story he'd written and the truth that was about to replace it. And for the first time since this began, he didn't look like my son. He looked like someone who had miscalculated badly and was finally facing the cost. When the door opened and other people stepped inside, the room filled with a different kind of energy, not aggressive, not loud, just firm, grounded, unquestionable, and questions were asked, names were spoken, explanations attempted, but the words slid off me like water. Because I wasn't fighting anymore, I was finished being alone in this, and as I spoke calmly, clearly, without anger or tears, I felt something inside me release, a long-held tension unwinding at last. Ha ha ha, because telling the truth without fear is a kind of freedom few people get to feel. He tried once more to speak for me, to explain, to soften, to redirect, but it didn't work, not now. Because the story no longer belonged to him, it belonged to facts, to systems, to witnesses, and as he was asked to step aside, to wait, to stop interfering, I watched the space around me open up again, my voice filling it instead. And that moment, quiet and unremarkable to anyone else, felt like victory to me, not because he lost, but because I was no longer invisible. As they continued their work, asking questions, making notes, ensuring I was safe, I sat back, exhaustion finally settling into my bones, and I allowed myself one honest breath, deep and shaking, because the hardest part was over, the part where you stand alone against someone who believes you won't resist. And as the night moved forward and the consequences of his choices began to take shape, I understood something that brought a soft ache to my chest. Control doesn't end with shouting or punishment. It ends the moment someone else sees you clearly and believes you, and in that moment, surrounded by voices that weren't trying to erase me, I knew this chapter of my life was closing, even if the final words hadn't been spoken yet. The house felt different after they left, sigh not quieter exactly, but settled like something heavy had been lifted and set down gently somewhere else, and I sat there for a long time without moving, my hands resting in my lap, feeling the ache in my bones finally catch up to me. Ha ha ha, because adrenaline can carry you only so far before your body reminds you of its limits, and yet beneath the exhaustion there was a strange calm. A steadiness I hadn't felt in months, maybe years, the calm of knowing that something important had been set right, even if the consequences were still unfolding beyond my walls. I didn't feel triumphant, and that surprised me. Because stories like this often end with anger or celebration, but what I felt instead was clarity, the kind that comes after a long storm when the air smells cleaner and your thoughts stop racing. And as I looked around my living room, really looked this time, I saw my life again, not as something fragile or temporary, but as something that still belonged to me, the chair where I drank my tea, the lamp I always forgot to turn off, the small scratches on the table from years of ordinary living, and I realized how close I had come to losing all of it, not through force, but through quiet permission. The days that followed were slow and deliberate, filled with conversations, paperwork, careful decisions made with people who spoke to me, not over me, and each step felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself, my voice steady as I explained what had happened. My hands no longer shaking when I signed my name, because I understood now that protection isn't about building walls against the world, it's about choosing where your boundaries belong. And I had allowed mine to blur for too long. There were moments when grief crept in, grief not for what was taken, but for what I'd overlooked, the warning signs I'd brushed aside, the instincts I'd silenced to keep peace. And I let myself feel that grief, quietly, honestly, because pretending you don't hurt doesn't make you strong. It just delays healing, and healing, I learned, begins the moment you stop apologizing for needing safety. Ha, and I stopped apologizing to myself most of all. I didn't cut my son out of my heart with anger, but I did remove him from control of my life, and that distinction mattered because revenge would have left me bitter. But boundaries left me whole, and as I moved through my days again, choosing what to do, when to do it, who to trust, I felt something return that I hadn't realized was missing: dignity, quiet and unannounced, settling back into its place like it had never left. Sometimes, late at night, I still replay the moment when I realized how close I was to disappearing into someone else's plan, and it sends a shiver through me, not of fear, but of awareness, because that line between independence and invisibility is thinner than we like to admit, especially for people the world has decided are done. And if there's one thing I want you to understand from my story, it's this. Age does not erase your right to choose to speak to protect yourself, no matter how gently someone tries to take those rights away. I look at my home now and see more than walls and furniture. I see proof. Proof that preparation matters, that your voice matters, that systems built with care can stand when people fail you. And I carry that lesson with me every day, not as a warning, but as reassurance. Because knowing you can protect yourself changes how you walk through the world, even when your steps are slower, even when your hands tremble a little. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside by someone who claimed to know what was best for you, let my story stay with you. Let it remind you that silence doesn't mean weakness and stillness doesn't mean surrender, and if stories like this matter to you, if they help you feel seen or understood, then stay here, subscribe for more, because there are so many voices like mine, steady, quiet, strong, waiting to be heard. I didn't win by overpowering anyone, I won by refusing to disappear. By remembering who I was before someone tried to decide that for me, and that's the kind of victory that doesn't fade with time, because it isn't about proving someone wrong, it's about proving yourself right, and as I sit here now, in my own home, breathing in the familiar quiet, I know this much for certain: no matter how softly someone tries to take your life away, you are allowed to take it back, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply speak, even when your voice shakes.